I love how you explain to people about how the hydrogeological cycle works and how water is filtered through the earth in different phases. That to me can kind of really make a difference between a filter that's this big and something the size of the earth. Can you just explain how water
Yeah, of course.
percolates through?
Well, most people are aware of what the hydrological cycle is, and we think of it. We think of water evaporates up, we think it rains back down, then it evaporates back up, and then it rains back down. But of course, there's this other portion of it called the recharge, and that's where water actually permeates down through the earth and finds its way deep down into aquifers. And there are many stages of cleansing that happen. People don't realize 60 feet of sand is a water filter, as good as any. But it's more than that, right? Because it moves first through biology, so it's going through the ecosphere itself, being filtered, of course, by all the plants and all of the microflora and microfungi as it moves through the soil layers. But under the soil layers, of course, are the clays, which are the supreme detoxifiers of the earth, and they move through those clays, and those clays electrically adsorb, not absorb, but adsorb all kinds of toxic ions, positively charged molecules. The water then continues down, sometimes even passing through carbon, like a massive Brita filter, if you will, deep down, permeating rock, layer by layer, until it arrives at the aquifer and then incubates in that place at low temperatures before it arises again, dropping more ions on its way to the surface, and eventually emerging as a spring. Now, that process, taking between hundreds and thousands of years often, is so superior, of course, to a small plastic filter that would go on somebody's faucet.
Definitely.
So the idea is, for me, hey, the earth is the supreme water filter that exists, and any replication thereof is simply a surrogate and may have some benefit, but of course can't replicate the processes involved. And again, as we've talked about, there's more to water than simply H2O molecules, and there's more than just its ions. There's a whole nother aspect of water which I think people don't realize, and science is starting to recognize, and yet, not as always, science fails to apply it to human health, and that's that there's more to water than just what's in it. It's how the water molecules arrange themselves, and that's been called structure, but really it's the hydrogen bond matrix or network, and that essentially means you can get water to align in all different ways based on how it's charged and what kind of charge it's carrying. And I think we'll eventually see spring water is biologically the most friendly water, and that other waters that have been industrially treated through these processes, like these filtrations we've talked about, are actually a bit dysbiotic. They don't really support life well. And as that information emerges, hopefully people will be more comfortable with the idea of gathering water from the ground, because one of the first things people say is, well, isn't it dirty if it's been in the ground? And it's funny, because obviously we know that's the source of
It comes
all
from the
water.
ground anyway. Daniel, when we're going out to find our springs, what are some good ways that you can test the water to make sure that it's fit for consumption?
Well, for most of us, it's not really optimal to have to take that water to a laboratory and then pay for those testing and things like that. And I don't think we really usually need to. The key question is there something in the immediate vicinity that could be polluting this water? In other words, if we have a spring emerging from the ground, is there a cattle farm right above it? Is there a
Canola
power plant
fields.
right there? Is there canola
sure.
fields? Is there something polluting it? Most of the time when we visit these springs, we're in sort of more open space, and that's not an issue. Second thing is, if the water's coming out of the ground with significant pressure and force, it's likely you're at the actual spring source and not at sort of a seep where the water's been underground, riding through dirt and riding through debris and popping out. If you actually have water moving out of the ground in a significant way, like most of the springs we're talking about, you know that water's coming from somewhere down deep, particularly if that water's cold. Now, there are, of course, the geothermal waters, and I'm not referring to these kind of hot springs or warm springs, but if you're at a cold spring and that water's coming out very cold, you know it's being accessed from pretty deep in the ground, therefore it's most likely very clean. Those kind of things are actually quite easy to just intuit and determine on one's own, and I personally have yet, after having sent thousands and thousands and thousands of people to do this as a practice, have yet to hear of anyone ever getting sick. I have personally yet to ever get sick from spring, so I think as long as that water is clear and clean and cold and coming out in a significant way in a fairly open space, we don't really have to be too concerned. Now, of course, every individual who does this, of course, they have to take responsibility. You have to take responsibility for yourself if you're going to do this. Because, of course, I'm not vouching safe for water sources that I'm not familiar with. But I personally have yet to have any negative experiences with that. Now, beyond that, a lot of us like to test little things. Like we like to test the TDS, which is a measurement of how many salts or how many electrolytes or ions are present in that water. And that gives us a determination of how hard that water is, and it helps us determine what waters we like best. If you're thinking, what does he mean, what waters I like best? Water's water. Well, of course it's not, and that's why so many different bottled waters exist on the market, and different mineral waters, and people have brand preferences. Actually, they have spring preferences because everybody sort of likes a different TDS count, how hard they like their water. I like to test the temperature of water. It gives me a sense of sort of what that quality is like, and the colder the spring, I find usually the higher the quality. Those kind of things, occasionally checking the pH maybe is another little game we can play. Helps us determine sort of, is that an alkaline water, is it a neutral water, is it slightly acidic water, and helps us kind of get a gauge on what this spring is like, so if we visit others, we start to learn more about water because we start to see how they profile differently. But of course, none of those tests can determine safety. When we're talking about water safety, we're talking about two things. Does it contain pollutants of man-made origin, or even sometimes mineralogically, in the case of, say, something like arsenic, or does it contain organisms that are dysbiotic to us, say bacteria that have, or maybe protozoa. If it contains those things, those are waters we consider polluted. However, again, I have yet to actually ever see that happen from a spring. So we're not talking about drinking out of streams and rivers. We're talking about spring sources at the source. It's pretty much a guarantee you're in a safe space if you arrive at a spring that fits that profile.
And Daniel, what's the best way for people to get a hold of you and your amazing work?
They can find me at danielvitalis.com, and through there you can find access to my company, surthrival.com, which carries very high quality food supplements. You can find findaspring.com, which is a worldwide spring database. You can find Raw Living Water, which is another project I'm involved in, and you can check me out on YouTube, where put my name in there, and of course there are many, many free videos where I have educated the public to the best of my ability for free, so you can just check me out there and see lots of talks and interviews that I do.
This is Dustin Russell from SustainaNation.com, inviting you to join us on the path to radiant health, sustainably, successfully.